Thank you. So next on our program, we're very privileged to have Mr. Wandile Sihlobo with us. Wandile is an agriculture economist and author. As the chief economist of Agris, he offers valuable insight into South African agriculture sector. Mr. Sihlobo has authored 2 influential books, A Country of Two Agricultures and Finding Common Ground, exploring the challenges and solutions within the sector. In addition to his academic and professional roles, Mr. Sihlobo serves on various government advisory councils and contributes to leading publications as a columnist and podcast host. And as Jeff just pointed out there outside, dynamite comes in small packages. Wandile, welcome and thank you so much, and we're privileged to listen to you.
You see, Omfani, if you were concerned about this height, you would have held me here. Thank you so very much, Omfani, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon to all of the members of the MPO. It's always great to be here in the province, particularly as I also hail not very far from here. In the northern parts of this province, somewhere there in King Williamstown, and also have family in the northern parts of the Transkei around the Lusikisiki and Engcobo areas. So when one is here in the province, it always feels at home. But what I thought I would do this afternoon is really try to perhaps share thoughts on about 3 aspects that you see reflected on that screen of the heading of my slide. You have heard a lot about some of the challenges that the province and the industry confronts, and I think the chairman's report nicely summarized some of those. And perhaps maybe in the next couple of minutes this afternoon, I would give you a break and talk about those aspects. And the first point I want to talk about is what is related to the BRICS story, because I'm sure many of you saw that about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, the South African president and various ministers all went to China, and we saw from when they came back, they were all excited about a number of announcements that they were saying they have signed with China, and that they needed to go to China so that they can begin to talk about trade. But one of the questions that many people like Johan Kutsie of Agri-SA, who's sitting right there in the far left, always ask is to say, if we are going to China then to talk about China, what is the value of BRICS? What's going on within the BRICS side? And I thought it might be important perhaps maybe to comment on that, because I do think that as South Africa, over the past couple of years, we have not benefited greatly from BRICS, particularly as the agricultural industry. But that doesn't mean that because we have not benefited a lot in the past, we should disregard BRICS. I still see it as an important market that if it's utilized effectively, we can actually gain a greater value there. From an agricultural perspective, BRICS is a region that I would say the agricultural imports a year, they are just north of $300 billion. But I think whenever we talk about it, we should always remember that BRICS on itself is not a trade bloc. It is just a group of politicians that have alignment in their thinking, and then they've decided that we will form that particular grouping for geopolitical matters. What we need to push for now is that there must be an economic ambition within the BRICS grouping, because without a strong economic interlinkages among these countries, the BRICS grouping may not last for long. So it is in the interest of all of the members that are there that the economic ambition of that grouping is fairly strong. And when you look at the products at which these core countries of BRICS actually import, it is really the products that some of the members do produce. You will realize that there's soybeans, there's maize, there's grain, there's dairy, there's fruits, there's wine. All of these are the products that make up that number that I was saying is just over $300 billion a year. But the intra-BRICS trade remains fairly low, because what ends up happening, although we say we are all friends sitting in this grouping, but commerce is actually done with countries that are outside of that. Many of those products that you see flowing in BRICS, they come from the non-BRICS countries. Either it's countries in the US, it's in the Europe, and all of those regions, which is why then we should say, why is the case that intra-BRICS trade remain low? And the reason intra-BRICS trade remain low is fairly that we continue to levy fairly higher tariffs amongst ourselves, and there's a lot of phytosanitary barriers that I think they still remain in this grouping. But if we acknowledge the progress that we have seen over the past, to say, just looking over the past 10 years or 5 years, this grouping continue to see enormous progress in as far as the import volume, then we must have a conversation about lowering those import tariffs so that over time, as the needs or the demand for various agricultural products grow in that grouping, we perhaps continue to benefit or start to benefit as some of the countries that are in that grouping. The numbers that you see shown in that chart, they only represent the original BRICS member countries, not the addition that we saw from Johannesburg, August 2023 conference. Those are just the original BRICS countries. When you begin then to add the likes of Saudi Arabia and the others, the numbers become even much more significant. And if you consider the population growth also in those countries, it makes all of this a worthwhile economical grouping if it is explored as such and not only viewed from the politics perspective. But I do also want to speak for the politicians to say, them going to China last week or about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago was not so much a bad thing. Because when you look at that BRICS trade that I was talking about 78% or so of those agricultural imports are actually by China. India, which also continues to be an important country, its second biggest market, perhaps when you're looking at the share perspective there, it's not as big as what we actually see in China, although the population in India is, as we know, which is has overlapped China and will continue to overlap, and it is also full of very young people. But in terms of the imports, China is the only game in town when we are talking about BRICS. It's the only game in town in terms of buying, but it's also the only game in town in terms of the influencing the decisions more robustly. And I think that if you have China on your side in that grouping, you tend to have a relatively better conversation than some of the members than if China is sitting on the opposite end of that direction. So I do think that the worthwhile conversation about to say, how do we begin to firm up our trade on that? But if we do go down that road because of the benefits that we see as South Africa, we must also acknowledge then that we will have to give something to the world. And I think this is where South Africa always find a conundrum to say, China wants greater access to our manufacturing, we want more access to their food industry, and how do we begin to make those trade-offs? And that's the key issue that always confronted Minister Patel on that. Because if you zoom in for a moment and you really look into that China's agricultural market, the Chinese spend over $200 billion each year importing just agricultural products. And that chart that you see there, if you see those bars, the dark blue bars, they actually give you the sense of what China is importing. And if you look outside of our industry and you really consider all of that South Africa puts to the world, I would say we can participate greatly there if that market could be open for us. But as we speak today, as South Africa, our exports into China, they only make up about 0.4% of what China has. We are less than $1 billion. And in our total agricultural exports, they are just over $13 billion. So even within China and all of the economic all the political integration that we do have with them, we are still in this particular industry not seeing much more greater access in this industry, which is dairy, but also agriculture as a sector in general. We continue to face those higher tariffs that I was talking about. But I do think that it's a conversation to confront because the most important statistic in that chart for me is just that trade deficit that you see widening in China. China has an agricultural trade deficit of about $117 billion. That's almost equal the economy of Kenya in terms of the GDP on that. And there is no way they will be able to fill that in within the next couple of years. I would say the next decade or so, we still have a leeway to continue to benefit in that market if we can resolve the tariff as well as the non-tariff barriers that exist in that particular market. For me, those are the things that I would be most interested on at this point around. But of course, if you were then to go back to the original point that I was making and say, as South Africa then, as we stand today, if we say we haven't benefited much from BRICS, how much exactly does BRICS account in our agricultural exports? The original BRICS members, they make up only about 8% of our agricultural exports. And to get a clarity of how small that figure is for a bigger grouping like that, the United Kingdom as a single country make up about 7% of our agricultural exports. So the BRICS as it stands today, they account for the same market share in our agriculture as the UK. And I do think that for the trouble that we get for being part of BRICS in terms of the global geopolitics, we do need to demand and work to actually get paid for all of those problems that we get there. Because from a geopolitical perspective, it's always an issue. Now you may ask then people like Jeff Every, who I work with for many years, to say, Wandile, you have been part and parcel of the BRICS agribusiness working groups. Why are you coming to tell us this? Why haven't you guys resolved this? The key issue is that South Africa has been adamant on actually saying we want greater access within the BRICS side in terms of trade. Johan were referred to at Agri-SA. There have been some of the people that have been championing that particular message alongside ourselves at Actors. And last year, we were almost closer to getting a bit of progress. But there was one country that opposed the sort of preferential market access within the BRICS in terms of agriculture. And that country was India. They were heading towards their election last year, and Prime Minister Modi had just returned from the US, where he had had that big lunch that many of you may have seen that was well covered. And the geopolitics in South Africa were pretty much bad last year at the time, because we had the Lady Arch situation and everything else. And no, India, given where he was sitting in the global geopolitical space, did not want to actually come on any form of unity on this. And the challenge with BRICS today is that you cannot get anything done without all countries agreeing. If there's one country that dissents, that point of the agenda doesn't get a pass. And that then becomes an issue today whereby the BRICS grouping has expanded to include important members like Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a big market. They import just over $20 billion worth of agricultural products each year. And there's UAE and many others, and Egypt and the likes. But the problem is, if that grouping becomes as that big and the rules of the game remains the way they are, which they were suitable when there was a few members, it also does mean that we may not actually get a lot of things faster the way that we like. But the point of championing trade is exactly what South Africa has taken forward even this year, because next month there will be 2 conferences that will take place. First one being the BRICS Business Council, which will be in Kazan in Russia, and then the other, which will be in Moscow in Russia, and then the political one will be in Kazan, also within Russia. And the key things that we have taken forward as South Africa, and they are at the annual report of the BRICS Business Council, is really those particular points that you see on the board, where we are saying we want a preferential market access for agricultural products to be adopted within that grouping. That should entail lowering the tariffs and removing the phytosanitary barriers. We understand that all of those things differ country by country. Therefore, there should be intergovernmental networks that will work on resolving those issues. And those are the points that we are taking forward there. As to whether then those points are adopted or not, it is something that we will all know by the end of October when the politicians leave Russia to come back. But my sense is that there is greater appetite for that to happen. Brazil supports that point. Russia themselves support that point. China themselves supports that point. The only country that is still sitting on the fence on a number of these things because of the power of the farmers grouping within that country, it is again India. If they do come to the table and we all agree, I would say that there's a lot more to be gained in that grouping. But with me having bashed India for the past 7 minutes, I would still say it is a worthwhile endeavor to continue to see if we can widen our access within that grouping for all of the agricultural products, because the world today is no longer as it was in the past. And South Africa's agriculture has transformed significantly from what we have seen in the past. And we do need to actually see greater market access to a number of countries for our products. Some of you may have seen that slide several times that I'm showing there, but the reason we do that is to highlight how many problems the world faces today. There are environmental issues that all of you are so well aware of that you confront in your farms and in your trading partners. But the issue of the geopolitics have also complicated the environment much more intensely today than in the past. The chairman's report was referencing that particular issue. But I think you were talking, Mr. Chairman, about that, highlighting the Black Sea issues. But what we see happening in the Middle East is getting complicated day by day. Just what had happened between Hezbollah and the people of Israel recently, I think it just points to those complications that you see happening there. And I think in essence, that is going to influence geopolitics, and those geopolitics will influence trade and friendships as we see in the world. And it will become much more difficult for small, open economies like South Africa. The reason South Africa pays attention into these things is exactly because of those charts that you see in the board, particularly the chart that is on your left-hand side of that screen. Because what it tells you is that we are a country that is seeing an agricultural sector that is highly dependent on exports. We are today exporting about 55% of what we produce in value terms goes to the export markets. If now we are talking about transformation in terms of growing the South African agricultural pie, bringing more people into the sector, but growing also the volume that will be produced. That volume cannot be adopted within the South African market. It has to be accommodated into the exports. And I think we need more diversity in the export markets. If you take a moment and you look in the chart on your left-hand side of that screen, it shows all of those markets. Africa, 40%, but I think the two bars we need to grow more is Asia and the Middle East, while maintaining the market access that we have in Africa as well as in Europe. But I think those two areas in Asia and the Middle East, that's where we have a greater capacity to see our sector in general being supported, which is why, again, the story of BRICS becomes so important when we're thinking about this. And we have to appreciate that the growth that the South African agricultural sector has seen over the past few years would not have been possible without exports. You take a moment and you look at that chart, you will see that agriculture is the only sector that has grown robustly over the last 10 years than most of the sectors of the economy. But if you ask what has been the catalyst behind that, there have been two major catalysts. It's the technological adoption and of course the farmer skills to deliver the greater yields, but also that demand pool that we are getting from the export markets, which has enabled that growth to remain profitable and be the way that it looks. Without the export markets, these are some of the things that we stand with being at risk when we are talking about the sector more broadly. And I think that's the story that is correct, even going back as far as 1994, seeing the sector that we have today, which has more than doubled in value and in volume terms. Exports are pretty much part and parcel of that story of delivering that growth. We are now the most food secure country in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And I think it is part of that at a national level. I know we have a lot of problems at a household level, but I think the farmers' efforts as well as that demand pool is what has delivered that growth. And what is more important for me is that we are the only African country in the top 40 global agricultural exporters, ranked at about number 32. And as best as I can tell, and looking at what happens in other parts of the world, we are going to remain the only country for some time that is there if, of course, we continue to open export markets, support technological adoption, and resolve some of the problems that so many of you are familiar with in your farms, animal health and other issues that you continue to try to resolve. But the point I want to underscore also is that the South African agricultural economy would not have been where it is today without the efforts of the dairy industry, the livestock industry at large, as well as our friends in the poultry sector. Because that slide is very busy, but the most important part is that all of the parts that I've highlighted, some are dark greenish, some are yellow, they point to all of the industries that are interlinked to all of us gathering in this room today. From 1994, if you look at the first part of that column, all the way to where we are in the 2020, that is about 75% of our farming economy. And as a dairy industry, although the numbers have come down of the farming units, you have actually remained part and parcel of the top six most important industries in the South African farming economy. And alongside some of our colleagues, and of course the citrus industry has seen much greater growth over that time. But the point is, you have been amongst the pillars of the industries that have sustained our farming economy to where it is today in South Africa. And I think going forward, it may likely to be that way because the numbers that we get from people like Freddie Mayer at BFEP, they tell us that over the next couple of years, they see an increased demand for feed, which means that whatever is happening in the livestock industry and what's happening in the dairy industry, what's happening in the poultry industry may continue for some time in terms of the demand. Those are the figures that our friends at BFEP are putting up in as far as the feed demand. And I guess our friends from the Free State University will probably see numbers like that when they are thinking about Lucerne demand and the other things, if they are stretching the story that they had told us before lunchtime for the next 10 years or so, thinking about the demand pattern of some of these products. What's even more important for me is that Ferdy's story and BFEP's story is consistent, even if you think about where they think that yellow maize and that soybean will come from. They do see the area growing for those commodities, while yellow maize and white maize and the other commodities area planting may remain flat. The point to take from the previous slide and this slide is really that this is an industry that may remain resilient for quite some time. Now that's the story of the BRICS and why it is important. And it is the first point that I wanted to make here, which I will conclude it by saying the conversation that our politicians were having in China, I think it is necessary because of those particular needs of exports for industries outside of ours that we are sitting with today. Let me transition to my second point that I wanted to put forward to the AGM today, which is the story of the macroeconomic conditions of South Africa, as to why should agriculture carry this burden and continue to be demanded to do all of that which you are already doing. The reason for that is because we are by now today possibly in one or ending what has been the most difficult decade in the South African macroeconomic story. If you take a moment and you look at that graph that is in the board, you don't need to study it closely, but the key point I wanted to emphasize is that since the late 1940s up until today, the last 10 years have been the lowest growth period in the South African macroeconomic space. And the challenge with that is the message that we all continue to emphasize to say, for every 1% growth in South African GDP, there's always about 0.5% improvement in employment. And new figures that are coming out of work by Gulam Balim, the chief economist at Standard Bank, he says for every 1% growth in his calculation now, he says, look, we get to see about 0.7% expansion in employment. And if you are in a country like South Africa where 6 in every 10 young people are out of work, and the unemployment on the adults is also just creeping closer to 40%, in an expanded definition, then you have a bigger problem of saying, how do you come out of that conundrum and actually see the macroeconomic space growing in a more robustly? Agriculture playing its part, but also the other sectors of the economy playing their part. Because if we don't grow, the societal problems that are outside now of the technical farming challenges that we face, but issues like demanding wages, stability in society, those will be some of the problems that all of us will begin to confront in the areas that we are operating in. And because the correlation is clear there, without growth, there will be no employment. And I think that these social ills that we all always complain about is something that may confront us even more intensely. Already in South Africa, a message that we have all made clearly, there is economic anxiety in this country. People, because they are out of work, poverty levels are where they are also losing hope in institutions, in government, in provincial government, national government. Some are not even voting. And you may not blame some, because the government officials in a number of provinces, they are also not doing their work. Therefore, it's not unjust for people to actually not have hope on that. But the most critical thing is that there is no country that has actually seen stronger growth when institutions are that weak and the perception of its citizens is that poor. The only way the country can change its macroeconomic shape, we have to have the strong institutions, and we have to have a citizenry that is fully engaged on the business of running the country. And I think for me, if you are thinking about then the GNU now, when you say what are some of the most important problems that they are facing, some of the most important problems that they are facing is really trying to say, how do they change that particular picture and begin to deliver a bit of growth on that. I'm trying to move my stuff and I see that things are not moving well. There it is. The reason for that is really the story that we show. I know I've been showing you a lot of graphs after lunch, and I could see Jeff there is being strained to look at all of these graphs. But Jeff, I would insist that you do look at these graphs, because the one that is on your left-hand side there is possibly the most important graph that I think as South Africa we have to try to avoid. What that graph tells us is that in terms of the GDP per capita in South Africa, if we don't do anything, we may continue to see the GDP per capita in this country remaining in the negative. And in such an environment, this is where all of the social ills that we all fear would actually breed. If you look at the last 30 years of democracy in South Africa, you take the first 15 years and you compare it with the last 15 years of Zuma and Zondo and all of these issues. In the last 15 years, you were 13% poorer than the first 15 years because of all of the corruption and everything else. But if we don't get the GNU to work, you may remain in those levels and even worsened levels going forward. But luckily, there is optimism that has been brought by all of what we are having in the politics. The key thing then is to say, do we have the strategies then to optimize all of this optimism? Because optimism is fleeting. Even the president, he understands this, because when he came to office in 2018 for the first time, there was what we call Ramaphoria, and he seemingly didn't act as strongly on it, and Ramaphoria waned. The key thing then now is that, can we utilize the current sentiment to deliver progress in South Africa? And the important thing for me, which Johan may also expand on it when he gives his remarks just after the session, is that we do understand what needs to happen. What needs to happen is contained in a document of the government which is called Operation Vulindlela. That document of the government, which is called Operation Vulindlela, spells out those aspects into a range of things, which is that we need some reforms in energy, we need some reforms in transport, we need some reforms in water, on title deeds in terms of agriculture, as well, of course, on the mining rights. And the 2.0 of that document, which is the Operation Vulindlela, spells those levers out, where they say, look, we need to deal with the economic reforms, but also we need to deal with the aspects on safety, as well as some of the social things. The point being that we know what needs to happen in South Africa to get our economy going. We just have to implement that, implementing it via various departments and in collaboration with the private sector. And that which you see in the board there begins to sketch out the skeleton of what our macroeconomic thinking under the GNU should possibly look like. If we do implement and we make positive reforms in all of those aspects that are there, we may actually be rescued from the picture that is looking like that, which is a growth space that is less than 2% for some time. But if we do everything that was on the previous slide, this is what many analysts in certain banks have already said. ABSA says we can grow by over 2%. Johan Christine and the crew at the BR Stellenbosch University, they say over 2.2%. Citibank is also optimistic about where we could be, which means that we do know what we should do in South Africa. All that is necessary then will be implementing Operation Vulindlela. Let me close with a few points here that are for agriculture under the GNU, to say in agriculture what must happen. And I know many of you who are sitting here are in constant conversations with Minister Steenhuisen, Minister Nyotso, and all of the colleagues. But I'll make a few remarks, and perhaps maybe my capacity at the Presidential Economic Advisory Council about what are we thinking about and what is the President telling the ministers that he expects from them in their respective portfolios with regards to these two departments. The key thing that the President knows and appreciates is that there are problems in agriculture, and the sentiment indicator illustrates that. That graph that you see on the board is what we call the Agribusiness Confidence Index. All of that tells us is that it is below that dotted line, which means that the farming community in general in South Africa feels a bit more pessimistic about a range of things. And I think all of the inputs from Omfani, from Bertes that you read on his economic analysis, it speaks to some of the issues that the sector confronts, which is the droughts in the northern regions, the animal diseases that all of you knows well, the weak consumer demand that remains a problem, and of course the roads and the infrastructure that doesn't work well. I was talking to Dion from the co-op earlier. He and I did a long road trip sometime in 2017 across the Eastern Cape, and we were complaining about roads, and Dion was telling me that those problems of those roads, they've actually gotten worse this time around. Those are the things that I think the President understands and the others very well. The key thing then that you may ask is to say, if those things are understood, what exactly should be done about it? This is what at the Economic Advisory Council we have put forward that needed to happen, which we hope that's what encompasses the agricultural policy statement that will come out of the Department of Agriculture from the leadership, in addition to the points that many of you already told the folks there. The key thing that we say is that the Agriculture and the Agro-Processing Master Plan remains an important document. We don't all like it, we don't all agree with all of the aspects of it, but we still think that it has aspects of commonality, and those aspects of commonality must be prioritized. The second aspect then, of course, is the issues of biosecurity, which all of you already are well ahead of that, and it has a lot of glitches that Omfani was talking about that needs to be resolved. But I will add on biosecurity and say it's not only about animal health. There's a lot of problems on the horizon about plant health, which I think in South Africa in general, we need to pay similar attention on the plant health issues. And of course, the Act 36 matters are well understood, but we do also need to think about how do we revitalize the OBP and the others. I mean, in the report that you were giving, I could say here, you did speak exactly on the challenges of OBP and how many vaccines are left now and the capacity that has waned off over some time. And I think that's something that in South Africa we need to confront. Rural crime, roads, and many others. But I think those particular points that you see there implemented alongside the blended finance instrument is what we all hope would give us a bit of a leeway in terms of seeing some progress in this sector. Let me transition to my last point here before I conclude, to say, if then that is what Minister Steenhuisen is getting from the presidency, what is Minister Nyotso getting from the presidency? What Minister Nyotso is getting, his message is also quite simple, which is that land reform in South Africa is about 3 legs. it's land restitution, it's land redistribution, and it's land tenure. Over time, as a country, we have made minimal progress on land restitution. On land tenure, we have made almost zero progress. Jeff and I were talking outside, and he was talking about this issue of a lack of title deeds. Because in 1994, when land tenure came in, it was not only targeted on saying the farms that are bought from white farmers to government should be given with title deeds. It also talked about the former homeland areas, of saying let's strengthen the land rights in the former homelands so that those areas could be developed commercially over time. But in those areas, we all know that in communal areas, nothing has changed today compared to what it was in the 80s in as far as the land governance of those areas. And even in some of the areas then that are on land redistribution, much of the land that was bought between 2006 up until to today, much of that has not been transferred with title deeds to anyone. The title deeds were in the period of 1994 to 2005 in greater part. But the positive thing then is that much of that land is still within the government books, which is that 2.5 million hectares that you see are circled in there. Now you can make a decision there and a choice and say, if then, and by the way, that chart that you see there is the evolution of South African land reform from 1994 all the way up until today. It is 25% of the 30% target that the ANC had talked about, not 9% as the EFF and the others used to always like to say. But the point then could be saying that 2.5 million hectares that has not been transferred to people, you could view that as a fault, which it is, but you should also think about it in the context of our recent 15 years or so, where we were under the state capture. Because if that land was transferred with title deeds and transferred to bad individuals, we would have lost it all. Today, that land is valued at about 12.8 billion rands. It is still in the government land holding account, which means at least we could still do something with that asset, although there is degradation in some of the farms on that. And if we select the beneficiaries appropriately, I still think that we have a better asset in our hands than if all of this would have happened under the state capture and we would have lost all of that public resource and allocated it into wrong hands. What is the policy then that Minister Nyotso is being told at the presidency? That slide that you see there begins to summarize only one aspect of that department, which is the issue of land redistribution, which is that land needs to be transferred to individuals with title deeds, and that's official. The second point, though, is that it may happen still through the Land Reform Agency. I know many of you are tired of hearing this. I've been talking about it for 4 years. Jeff is laughing at me. I first told him about it in 2019. It's coming, Jeff. These things come. They move slow in Pretoria, but they will get there. And right now, that land will be transferred into the Treasury under the assets and liability. The Land Bank may be involved in the beneficiary selection criteria, amongst others, as well as the farmers from various regions in the country. The blended finance instrument will assist, if applied appropriately, in making sure that the beneficiaries that are selected, at least they do have access in that land. I'm emphasizing and singling out this particular point because I want to say, in terms of transformation, we will have transformation in South African agriculture, but not in a zero-sum game that many of us have thought about, perhaps maybe in the past, because there is an asset base that is sitting there. And I think we need to rethink transformation and view it in a way of growing the South African pie, not actually in terms of a zero-sum game, because there is now an asset base that is sitting on the table, but it's about how do we utilize that in a more appropriate way. And I will close on finally before sitting down by saying it's easy for me to say these things because we write them on paper. We don't get to be the ones that are executing them. And I know that there are capacity issues in the local government and provincial offices that all of you face head on. And some of it can be defeating in many areas. But I think at least we do have the ideas about where we could go about. And I think to execute any of that, it will need collaboration between the likes of Agri-SA, the likes of MPO, the likes of AgBiz, RMIS, and many of these colleagues. They are the ones that will have to assist in delivering that. We cannot outsource it only to the government. And I think it is through that collaboration that we will be able to achieve all of these things. Let me close by summarizing or saying, if you remember anything in this long conversation that I've presented here after lunch, you can perhaps maybe remember those 6 points that I've highlighted there, which is that within BRICS, it is worth our time. It's an investment for the future. And the second point is that on the domestic policy side, macroeconomic side, the Operation Vulindlela, we must support it. It is what could help us to deliver the growth. In agriculture, the master plan is not perfect, but it has areas of convergence. And I think we should focus on those areas of convergence and see if we can move a few steps forward by focusing on that. The blended finance and the release of land is what will help us on the transformation and growing the South African agricultural pie in this. And these things cannot be achieved by the government, all of them. They will need the private sector participation, but the government has to think clearly about the incentive on doing this. And they do understand also the decline of the rural communities that we all continue to see. And I thought I should focus particularly on those things because that is what at the Economic Council we are currently thinking about a lot when we are thinking about this sector. But with that, Omfani, I've been talking for 39 minutes exactly. That's a long monologue for one man. Let me stop. Thank you.